So let me give you a brief bio of Mr. Fisher. And this is what I have, I believe if, and there's anything wrong, Mr. Fisher, you feel free to let them know, you correct me, but I have that Mr. Fisher is the Innovation Program Manager with the U.S. Department of Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Service. And that they are mainly focused on understanding the impact that emerging trends and technologies have on government finance, which I think is extremely intimidating in a way to me. Think about government finance, and when they start talking about the budgets and the deficits, that's it kind of overwhelms me. But money's not my thing. I'm a word person, so. Craig leads the agency's blockchain work, and he and his team, they carry out 3 proofs of concept over the past 3 years. Prior to his current position, Mr. Fisher held positions with a Big 4 consulting firm. He was the chief financial officer were you the chief financial officer for the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform? Is that correct?
No, so I worked for a while when I was at the Office of Management and Budget. I worked for the CFO Council at that point.
Okay.
So all the 24 CFO agencies, CFOs would get together and talk about fun things within financial management. So I staffed that for a couple of years.
Oh, okay. So you were the staffing person behind the CFOs. Well, interesting. Well, let me let you go ahead because I'm botching this up. Go ahead and tell us some more about you, and then you can go right into your presentation, okay?
So brief background. So my name is Craig Fischer. As was mentioned earlier, I work within a very small innovation team. We have about 17 of us that sort of explore some of those emerging trends and technologies that could impact financial management. And when I say financial management, it's roughly I would sort of characterize that as money movement and the accountability for that money. So as you heard, right now with COVID, we're sending a lot of payments out the door. We do all those payments. We do most of like the Social Security benefits. We do 87, almost 90% of all the payments coming out of the federal government is processed by my bureau. We do also a lot of the collections. So tax collection, things of that nature. We have the systems that all that money comes into the government. So the way I like to think about what we do is a little bit more like the nation's bank when it comes to federal payments, movement of money, and the accountability for that money. Some of the things that is important for us is transparency, making sure that these funds are accounted for. So I'm trying to stress to you that really my scope when we're thinking about innovation projects, things that we're trying to improve have a lot to do with the movement of money and the flow of money. We also do sell the debt. So when we don't balance the budget, which we haven't for quite some years, we sell debt. We have the systems that actually do that to fund the operations of the government. So we play a pretty critical role in making sure that people are getting paid, money that's coming in is accounted for, and selling that debt. So it's a pretty hefty, anxiety-ridden sort of job, I suppose you could say. This is perfect. Let's just stay right there. So really, I'm looking at ways to improve this. So back in 2017, or these processes in which we move money. So back around in 2017, part of my job as a sort of an innovator, sort of like scanning the environment, seeing what's out there, what's new, what's fresh, what are some of these things that could impact federal financial management. I kept on reading this thing called blockchain, and I think for all of you too, I think this is I think one of the really important concepts for me, and the reason why blockchain became such an important thing, is because this idea of being able to move value in a peer-to-peer way without an intermediary was a really powerful idea for me. And the reason why I started to think that this is something that I wanted to become much more aware of, considering how it could impact what we do within the fiscal service. I was seeing what was happening in the crypto space at that time. I was seeing how the financial services industry was getting much more involved in understanding what was happening. Given our nature as a bank, I wanted to become much more knowledgeable about that as well. One of the very first things that we did, and I think this could be important as well as you start thinking through how do you communicate something so complex as blockchain technology. In my case, I thought like, wow, this could be a really, really interesting use case for this thing called intergovernmental payments. So what an intergovernmental payment is that the government, believe it or not, actually buys and sells things from each other. And we pay for those things. So I may buy some nuts and bolts from the Defense Logistics Agency, or I may buy services from another agency, and we pay for that. The problem is that we've never really been able to have a really good set of books to reconcile all of these payments and collections. So we always get like audit findings because of that. And I thought, wow, what DLT and blockchain could be a really good use case for intergovernmental payments, because everybody would be working off of the same ledger. Come to find out, when I went to present this idea to my leadership, I said, I have a really good use case. It's intergovernmental payments. It could help some of the audit problems we have with that. The initial reaction I got was like, not over our dead bodies, because it was such a risky thing to start with. So I had to sort of backtrack. And that's kind of what this slide two is sort of showing you is the really first foray into learning about blockchain and distributed ledger technology was to try to find something that could really show the promise of what blockchain was, detangle it from things like Bitcoin and other the cryptocurrencies, but really show kind of like what it could do. And that's what we started with physical asset tracking. And that was really sort of that foundational understanding that we gave ourselves to understand what blockchain was and what it could do. And around physical assets, really what we're talking about here is that when you start with a government agency, you're typically issued like a phone, a laptop to do your work. And we spend a lot of time manually going and validating, doing inventory checks of all of this property. So what we did is we did a little proof of concept where we effectively started to look at how we could actually better manage and track cell phones using blockchain, where we uploaded sort of a blockchain application onto each phone. And just by the nature of using that phone, when you were turning it on, it would speak to the blockchain saying that you turned on your phone, therefore you probably have that phone. It showed how you could do a peer-to-peer asset transfer, because today we have a third party that has to come in there and actually have to help us transfer that asset. So it just really gave us sort of this foundational understanding of what blockchain was, and really sort of like clearly showed how blockchain worked in a very non-risk way. So that was really the first thing that we did. After we did that, we got some leadership buy-in, went to the next use case where we started looking at managing and tracking software licenses. So the federal government spends about $8 billion a year on software. And the problem that we were trying to solve there is that we buy all of these software licenses, but we don't manage it really well. Kind of like we put it in, we buy the software and we'll put it in the shelf. We don't realize we have it. And then we went to buy that same software, so we keep buying it. So we thought we could use blockchain to give us that real-time transparency inventory of like everything that we had. This one actually turned out to be a use case that we found didn't actually, wasn't right for blockchain, given that it wasn't completely a digital end-to-end solution. We still had people coming down into your office to upload that software onto your computer. So it just wasn't sort of the right use case for blockchain right now. But it did allow us to get to where we are today, where we are looking at it for facilitating grant payments. And I'll get into a little bit of what the problem was at that point, what we're trying to solve. But I did want to sort of say, again, I'm looking at this from a sort of financial use cases. What are some things that we can do to manage money? But I think it was originally said at the very beginning, you know, there's a lot of different use cases out there with respect to blockchain. I think the financial services is one of the big areas right now that you're seeing a lot of activity, but you're also seeing a lot of that in supply chain and sort of international finance, trade finance, things where you have these brokers, these third parties, kind of being the arbiters of the information they're learning right now that blockchain could be one of the ways to sort of disrupt that and make it a more peer-to-peer trustworthy way to transfer an asset. But I have just a few more slides, but I did want to just stop there because I want to make sure that I'm answering your questions. I'm going to get into a little bit of this use case, and I'm going to end on kind of a bigger picture of the way I think about blockchain and what makes a good use case as you're starting to think about this yourself. But I just want to pause there just to see if there's any sort of questions or if there's any questions in the chat as well. Feel free. Let's make this as informal as possible.
I had a question about like the individual block in a blockchain.
Yep.
So like my understanding is that one block contains data, whatever that data may be, a hash, and then the hash of a previous block. Is that correct or?
Yeah. I think you pretty much got it. I think so. The way that blockchain, and again, I'm not going to be able to be the technician on this, but the way that the novel thing about blockchain technology, what it allowed us to do, what it allows us to do today that we couldn't do before without blockchain, is that it does something where it prevents double spending. And what double spending is exactly kind of what it sounds, is that before when we tried to create digital money, just like you do with an email, just like you do with any sort of file, you can copy it. So we can't have a financial or monetary system where you can just copy money. Blockchain kind of stopped that from happening. It prevented the double spending. So think of it like this. If you send an email from one person to another, you can just forward that email on, you can copy it, you can keep it. In a blockchain scenario, that once you send that email to another person, it would leave your inbox. You don't have it anymore, and it would be in the other person's inbox for them to do what they wanted to. So blockchain allows that to happen because today within the banking system, we use banks. I have to use and go through a bank. Even if I Venmo you money, that it feels like it's a peer-to-peer system, but it's actually going, and our banks are talking. They're saying, hey, take this out of Craig's account and put it into this person's account. And they're doing that settlement. With blockchain, you can remove that bank. So what's happening is that when you do, say, transfer something, an asset, to another person, that is one of several transactions that are occurring in any sort of period of time. I think like in the Bitcoin, it's like every 10 seconds, these transactions are happening, and it puts them into like a block. And then it basically timestamps that block, appends it to the block that it validated just before, and creates this sort of ongoing audit trail that kind of lasts, well, forever. So you can easily go and you can search and you can sort of see where these transactions took place because it's all sort of within this database. But yeah, you're right. It's effectively just a block of it's a block that is sort of chained together, but that block within it is a bunch of different transactions that are occurring. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think just to kind of answer your question about what are the use cases? Why would we use this new thing called blockchain? What value does it give us? I mean, I think from the core, again, going back to the core problem we're trying to solve, solving that double spending, the way that the technology sort of prevents double spending, I always like to think of it has some positive benefits for financial management and some other industries. And I think it's these 5 things. So I think that when you start looking at blockchain, when does it add value? For the first and foremost, it's incredibly transparent. So all of these transactions that are occurring are sort of out there for everybody to see. And that transparency, in our case, the grant payment use case that I was sort of talking about before, that additional transparency, we're turning that into a lot less reporting that the grant recipients have to do because we see everything now. We were using the banking system to transfer these funds between the federal government to the grant recipients. And because we couldn't see all the data that was being transferred, we were asking them to do a lot of reporting. With blockchain, those transactions and the information that you put into those blockchain tokens creates a great degree of transparency. In fact, I would say the number one reason why federal government is looking at blockchain technology to improve something is because of the transparency benefits. So we lean heavily on that. So if you're thinking about use cases, why would I use transparency is one of those things. Automation. So this is where you can actually start to program the blockchain to do specific things based on whatever criteria that you want. So in my case, if I say, I'm going to create some sort of control that says, this funding cannot go down to a grant recipient if it's over $100, I have to approve it. So you can embed that logic into every token that you sort of mint, so to speak, creating a lot more sort of control and automation over what we do today. Efficiency, again, that peer-to-peer nature, the fact that I don't have to go through a third party, it's much more faster than it is using the traditional ACH rails that we use today for things like Venmo. Again, even though that feels peer-to-peer, it still takes a few days for that to clear in your checking accounts, your bank accounts. The immutability aspect of it, the fact that we all are working off of the same ledger and we can't change that ledger, creates a really good sort of audit trail for everything that has happened. So if you need something or need a system where you need sort of a heavy audit trail and it's sort of a tamper-proof audit trail, again, blockchain is one of those things to look at. And then lastly, and I think this is one of those undervalued things that I typically don't talk about a lot either, but I think it's really important, is the resiliency aspect of a blockchain network. Because you have these different, what they're called nodes validate transactions, because you have several of these, sometimes hundreds of these things working in tandem together to keep the network secure. There's no single point of failure. So there's no single point of attack. So there's a lot of things even within the federal government where OPM data is getting hacked, things of that nature. In a blockchain ecosystem, it's a much more difficult thing to do. So when I start thinking about use cases, and I start thinking about what are the right things for me to start looking at, I go to this sheet and say, do I need additional transparency? Do I need a degree of automation? Do I want to be faster? Do I need a heavy audit trail, or do I need a system that's going to be resilient? These are sort of the questions that I ask myself. But yeah, I think that going back to your original point around sort of NFTs and decentralized finance, I mean, I think that within the decentralized finance area, I think that people are learning that you can get a higher yield going outside of the banking infrastructure when you're lending out money. So I think gaming is becoming more popular as well. But I think we're at this sort of place in history where we're trying to figure out where blockchain actually does add value and where it doesn't add value. We're at the really forefront of all of this. So anyway, I spoke a lot and sorry about that. But hopefully that helped. And let me know if there's any sort of follow-up questions for that. So I just wanted to walk through just really quickly what the problem we're trying to solve and how it solves it for us. So today in that top bucket, you're going to see how the federal government gives out a lot of grants. A lot of these grants go to educational institutions like your own. HHS gives a lot of grants for health and human services related type activities. But typically these grants don't just stop with that first tier payments recipient called the prime recipient. A lot of times those prime recipients turn around in their chair and they send money further downstream. When they do that, when money is going from that prime recipient down to that subrecipient, it's using banks to do those transactions. It's moving money, so it has to use banks to do that. We, the federal government, don't have the information, so we don't even know when it occurs. So because of that, and because transparency is so important to the federal government of how we spend taxpayer dollars, we ask for those prime recipients and those subrecipients to give us a lot of reporting. So the problem we were trying to solve is these prime recipients and subrecipients do so much reporting that it really spends about, I think, almost half of their time is spent on administrative type duties. So how do we alleviate that? Is blockchain one of those things that could actually help alleviate some of that burden? So as you can see on the bottom, the future state, where our hypothesis is that if we use blockchain technology to transfer that funding from the federal agency down to the prime and then down to the sub will have that real-time transparency with where that money is at any given time. And we won't have to have such a burdensome reporting process. And we do this through this process called tokenization. And I think tokenization, and I think it was mentioned at the very beginning about you might be having somebody come in and speak about this. This to me is like one of the more interesting features of blockchain technology. And it's really one of those sort of concepts that's kind of hard to understand, but like once you get it, you get it. And I can't stress this enough. Like the thing that's interesting about blockchain is that when you are transferring an asset, you are not transferring the actual asset. You are transferring that representation of an asset. In our case, that is a grant award. So if you see on this left-hand side, this is an actual grant award that was awarded by the National Science Foundation. And you can see there's all this information that is loaded on these grant letters. What we do, and basically the reports that they are asked to provide, all that information is kind of resides within this grant letter. It's just that we don't know when this funding is being used or how it's being used. So what we did in our proof of concept, what we're trying to learn is that through this process of tokenization, we will extract and then digitize these really important data elements and put it into a blockchain token. So it's the grant information, those key dates, the awardee information, and we're combining all that information with the award amount, the actual money that's being transferred. Now, this is the one very unique thing that I think is novel in grants payments or in payments in general, that we're taking the purpose of that payment and combining it with the actual payment in a way that we've never been able to do before. And by doing that, and as this token travels, from the slide before, that token travels from the government to that prime recipient to the subrecipient, all of this information resides with it. So this is how we are using tokenization, that additional transparency, as I said before, to really unlock our ability to see where these tokens are at any given time, add some internal controls around spending that we want, and have this really good audit trail for where this funding is at any given time. And one of the things I do want to mention, and I'll stop there and I'll pause there for more questions, but when we tokenize this grant letter and all that information is within a blockchain token, that token travels throughout the ecosystem until it gets to that very final recipient who's actually going to be using the money to buy the microscopes or perform the work of the terms of that grant. At that point, then they will redeem that token. So they can't buy anything with this token. It's just a representation of the money and all the information. So when they redeem that token, then that information is sent back to that home agency, whoever awarded that grant, and then they will actually make that payment to that final recipient. Then that's when we bring the banking system back in. So we're not, and this is important, I think some people miss this, we're not actually transferring real money until that very last transaction, but it allows us to see all of that rich information in a way that we've never seen before. So let me just pause there and to see if you had any questions about that, or frankly, any way that I can be helpful.
My question is about the tokenization part. And so tokenization, as you mentioned, is representation. It's not actual currency. And so for it to actually work, does every step in the process have to be able to be digitally traced? So in order for tokenization to be efficient, each part of the process or each piece of logic wrapped into the criteria has to have some digital component. Is that true?
So this document you're seeing right now, which is the National Science Foundation, this is actually a piece of paper, and we could probably have some sort of AI bot go in there and extract this data, but we have to digitize this information. So to answer your question, yes, I'd have to think it all the way fully through, but I think the answer is yes. So we are we are pulling all this information in digitally. And the way that we're doing it, again, it's the proof of concept, just to test the use case. We're keying in all these things. And then once we press, like, say, the enter button, it writes all of this information onto the blockchain for all to see. And it creates that blockchain token. So in order for this token to get passed from the, let's say the first step would be to pass it after the tokenization, would be to pass it from the federal government to that first prime recipient. The prime recipient, or the government and the prime recipient, both need to have a digital wallet in order to send and receive that digital asset. So once it is on the blockchain, there's not a lot of, I can't think of anything in our case, analog type activities that would occur while that asset is, for that asset to transfer from entity to entity. It's all via your digital wallet. Does that
Awesome.
make
That
sense?
answers
Now
yes,
okay.
that does. And I think it illuminated the necessity for a digital wallet. And I think that's really what I was searching for. And so thank you for that.
Yeah. So one of our challenges that I have already identified is that in order for a blockchain, like you got to look at, like, you do innovation, you got to look at, like, the change, right? How much change am I asking people to absorb? And in this case, we are, in order for this to work, we are asking about 50,000 grant recipients to download a digital wallet that would enable them to transfer and redeem those tokens. So that's it. And again, I think one of the things that we don't talk about, I think blockchain has a lot of upside. Some of the downside is the change management that comes along with it. And I think one of the things that I do want to stress, and I think, as you are trying to think through how do you communicate something like blockchain technology, I think one of the pitfalls that I fell for earlier in my sort of describing this is I was spending way too much time trying to describe how the technology worked, and I was screwing it up all the time. So I was trying to explain how it worked, and I wasn't spending enough time on the value that it gave people. Like, at the end of the day, this has to help people. It has to solve a problem. Otherwise, we're never going to use it. So as you're thinking through, that, I think having, like, how does this help me? Like, that's constantly sort of that question that I'm asking or probing is, like, does this really scratch an itch for people? Will we use this? So it's just something to think about as you're starting to put together your own content. Like, how could you communicate that this is going to be helpful? How can somebody walk away with that emotional, like, oh, my life just got better? That to me is the key to, like, some of the diffusion of ideas such as, like, blockchain that are rather esoteric, is finding and simplifying this really complex technology in a way that touches people's emotional being. So that's one of the things that I would think through that's some of the advice that I learned is moving this from a proof of concept and moving it down to pilot, is finding those things where real people say, my life just got better.
My name is Kadis. If I want to learn more detail about the process and the transaction that you just showed us.
This is more of a lesson in innovation than it is blockchain. But one of the things that we learned is that doing demos of this application was taking a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so we said there has to be a better way to do this. So what we did is we created a URL that anybody can go to and walk through the steps of how this application would actually work. And the URL and the password is right there for people to play around with. But this walks you through the actual application. This way, we were just able to send it off to so many different people to get so many more different pieces of feedback and be able to pressure test this in a much more easier and cost efficient manner than just doing all these demos. So I would definitely go to URL to play around with the actual application. On our website, again, I'm from the Office of Financial Innovation and Transformation. If you just put FIT, F-I-T, and Treasury, will come up. We do have several blogs that we've actually written about what we're doing and next steps and kind of where we're headed. I did just kind of focus on what we kind of did with this use case, but we have a lot of other things that we're planning on doing with connecting this into the actual banking system to make those payments happen, and getting this into a much more pilot scenario. So I would start with that, and then lastly, I would just say if you're interested, shoot me a note. I'm happy to. I love doing this kind of stuff. You are the future. I'm old hat at this point, so the more I can feed you and get your wheels turning, I'm happy to do that. I think it's important. So anything I can do personally, just let me know.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to say thank you for everyone. I really appreciate the repeat attenders who are here again. Some faces and names are becoming very familiar to me. I think we also want to thank Mr. Fischer for being here and sharing his knowledge with us. I think his passing the proverbial baton to you all, calling himself the old hat and you guys the new innovation, is a great way for us to be looking at what we're doing today. You and what this competition is about. You guys are the future. You are, I mean, definitely the future is now, but you're the future because your innovation and the way you look at the world is different from how we have looked at the world and experienced the world. So we definitely are looking to you all to be innovative, and these videos are just a first step. So with that said, thank you for being here. Everybody have a great week, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.